Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 35 from the Road to Latin textbook. Now we're going to be starting with the first story, which is called De Filiabus Sabinorum, which is talking about the Sabine women and sort of the beginnings of Rome and where the population comes from. Now before we dive in, like I always tell you, if you want more resources on this story or the Road to Latin textbook, you can always take a look at my website. You'll find all my stuff there, vocab lists, vocab games, grammar notes, videos, just everything you'd need. I think in terms of what we do here, the grammar notes are probably going to be the most useful for you because particularly with this chapter, there's a little bit more of a complex grammar idea on participles, which I can't really cover all in this video. So I'll just kind of give you a short background before we dive in. But you can find all the full notes and everything on Nova Latin. Feel free to take a look. Now, like I said, before we dive in, I will give you a quick background on the grammar. But before we do that, just some ideas to help you move through this chapter in the textbook. I would always encourage you to start with the vocab. So take the vocab list either from my site or from the book, wherever you can find it, practice it, and make sure you feel really, really comfortable with the vocab before you do anything else. It's impossible to read these stories, are really difficult, I would say, if you don't know what the words mean. So just having a strong foundation in the words themselves and their meaning sets you up for success with everything else, regardless of how the grammar goes for you. Then when you feel comfortable with the vocab, you do want to take a look at the grammar, try to work your way through and get at least a general sense of it. You don't have to be perfect, but if you can understand what the grammar is, it'll make the story a little bit more useful to you because the story brings out the grammar in context. So you're going to see a lot of repetition on participles in this chapter, which is sort of the grammar topic. You're going to see that in the two stories. So if you know what they're about, that gives you sort of a leg up and it helps you use the story in a more useful way, I would say. Okay. When it comes time to reading, what I'd always encourage you to do is find a classmate or a partner, someone you can read the story to aloud, right? Work on your speaking, your pronunciation. And then if they can read it back to you, you can work on your listening skills. Those are the best ways to do it. You never want to just read this in your head or translate in your head. You want to bring it to life because you might be someone who learns better through listening or speaking, right? You don't want to just shut that part of your brain off and only do writing. And it'll help you with your reading comprehension skills as well. So I'd always recommend that. The last recommendation I do is use the read and reread method. So if you're reading through this, you want to write down any areas that you get stuck on, whether it's vocab, grammar, whatever it is, make a list. When you're done with your first read, go back to your list, try to solve all the problems. So if it's vocab, that's easy. Just look up the vocab words. If it's grammar, try to look. It's probably something from this chapter that you haven't mastered yet. But if it's something old, you can always look that up and try to figure out where you were going wrong. Then when you feel good, go back and read the story again and do the same thing. And you repeat that process as many times as you need to until you hit a point where you can read through this, you understand everything, you have no problems at all, and you don't need to reference any sort of translation or vocab or anything like that. Okay? So if you haven't done that yet, pause the video here, go back and do it, and then come back to the video, obviously, and kind of double check your work. But that's where we'll start here. I'll assume that you've done this and you're using this as just sort of a double check to make sure you're on the right path, which is totally fine. So like I said, the grammar for this chapter is something called participles. So we'll do just a quick overview because we can't do all of it in this video. And like I said, you can find other resources on my textbook. But in general, participles are kind of interesting and they're a little tricky because in English, we don't use them as often as they do in Latin, right? Latin loves participles. But participles are adjectives that come from verbs. They're verbal adjectives. It's kind of one way to think about it. So if I give you a sentence like this and said, the closed door cannot be opened, there's a word there, closed, right? What's it doing? It's describing the door, right? So it's working like an adjective. But close comes from a verb, to close, right? So this is what we mean by a verbal adjective. It's a verb or a form of a verb acting as an adjective, okay? So what I'm really saying here is the door having been closed, right? But either way, I'm describing the door with a verb. You can do that in English or in Latin. These are called participles, okay? So in this chapter, you're going to learn 3 Latin participles: the present active participle, the perfect passive participle, and the future active participle. And you'll notice that there's voice here, active and passive. That's important, right? And the different tenses will kind of work our way through and give you a chance to see what it's all about. So the first one we're going to think about are present active participles, okay? So these are the ing in English. So when you take a verb like to run and you say running, that's the participle form, right? The present participle. Same idea. So in Latin, when you see these, you want to use the ing translation: running, jumping, skipping, laughing, sitting, whatever it might be. Okay. To form them, it's pretty straightforward. You go to the second principal part, which is the infinitive. You drop the re, and you add an ns for the nominative singular. right? So this is a quick pause. This is why present participles in the nominative singular are easy to spot, because that ns ending is so unique. You'll see words like stans for standing, or ridanes for laughing, right? They're just easier to spot. For all the other cases, though, and remember, these are adjectives, so they have cases. You're using the nt ending, which is also kind of easy to spot. It's actually why you have the nt in the word present. So there you go. So this third declension, after that, you're using third declension adjective endings. So for everything except nominative singular, it's third declension adjectives, okay? And it's got the nt sort of infix there, which gives it away. So to give you an example, if you had kuro kurere, meaning to run, you would take kurere, the infinitive, drop the re, you add an ns for the first one, so kuranes means running, and then for the rest of them, you're putting an nt, right? So current is where you're starting. Then the endings are third declension adjectives, like I said, which is why you have currentis, currenti, currentem, currente, and down the line. These all mean running, right? That's kind of the translation, but the different cases are how you're using it in the sentence. So in other words, if I say something like, I see the hat of the running boy, right? That would be genitive, because I'm showing that it belongs to the boy, and the boy happens to be running, right? We'll kind of dive into it more, but that's why you have cases happening here. All right. An important idea: the present active participle is describing actions happening at the same time as the main verb. That doesn't mean that they're in the present tense. That's an important note. So you can say something like, I saw the laughing boy on my walk this morning. I'm talking about an action in the past. I saw, right? But what I'm saying with the participle laughing, which is a present participle, I'm saying that at the time I saw the boy, at the same time he was laughing. So you might have to unpack that or rewind the video for a second, but it will make sense when you think about it. I'm saying when that action was happening, when I was seeing the boy, he was laughing. Okay. That gets a little tricky for my students because they hear present participle and they assume it means present tense, not necessarily the case. All right. The second type of participle is the perfect passive participle. So we see these a lot, right? The PPP. These are translated as having been blanked, or you could just say blanked in English, right? So closed in that example I gave you, right? The closed door can't be open. Closed is a perfect passive participle, right? It really means having been closed, okay? So the PPP comes from the fourth principal part of a Latin verb, right? So you look at that fourth principal part, that is the perfect passive participle, right? So it uses first and second declension adjective endings, os, a, right? It represents the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. And all you have to do is just take the fourth principal part, right? So if I gave you the verb portare, you can see the fourth principal part is portatus. What it really is portatus but that's my participle. Okay, so if you just take it and change the case around to match whatever noun this participle is going with, you've got a perfect passive participle, right? It's not too bad. And since it's using those first and second declension adjective endings, it's a little easier to spot. So in English, this would be the example of saying something like, the chef, having been praised by the guest, was happy. Having been praised is the perfect passive participle. Now, that translation also gets into the timing, which is important. The perfect passive participle, it's used to describe actions happening before the main verb. So if you look back at that English sentence, I'm saying the chef was happy. That's my main idea. Before he was happy, he was praised by the guest, if that makes sense. So the praising happened before he was happy. And you can kind of hear that in English without me describing it, right? The chef, having been praised, was happy. It all kind of makes sense. But those are perfect passive participles, okay? Or at least a quick snapshot of them. The last one we're talking about are future active participles. So these participles are translated as going to or about to, right? Something in English. That's the idea of the future part of it. So the future active participle is actually very similar to the perfect passive participle. It's the fourth principal part, but you stick a UR before the us, right? That's where you get the UR in future, right? Futurus. So if you look at porto portare again, the fourth principal part is portatus. I'm not using that. I'm taking portatus and I'm sticking a UR in the middle of it right before the US ending, and I get portaturus, right? So future active participles are actually really easy to spot, rather, because of the UR. That ur in the middle kind of gives it away. This type of participle, the future participle, is describing actions happening after the main verb, which makes total sense, right? Future. So if you go back to that that example I gave you, you'd say the guest going to praise the chef was pleased. So right now, the guest is pleased, right? And afterward, right, something that's going to happen after he's pleased is he's going to go and praise the chef. Okay, so that gives you a little idea in English on how these work. But the best thing to do is really practice them. Look at the textbook, do some practice problems, really work on them. Use something like Magistrula to get practice is always good too. And then use the story to really unpack where these participles are and help yourself see them. Okay, that's always the best way to do it, which is where we're going to go now. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's dive in. Remember, we're talking about Romulus and sort of the foundings of Rome, right? You're going to see how the Sabine women come into the story. So the story starts like this: you have Romulus, regni cupiditate adductus, nuntius ad gentes proximas misera. Okay, so Romulus, here you have adductus. That's a fourth principal part, right? It can mean influence, is really what it means, or having been influenced, because it's a PPP. And notice how the US is matching Romulus. So the having been influenced, right, or influence adductus is describing Romulus. That's why they're both masculine, noun, or singular. So you're saying Romulus, having been influenced by the desire, cupiditate, of a kingdom, right? Regni. So cupiditate regni means like the desire of a realm, of a kingdom. So having been influenced by that, right, what did he do? Remember, the PPP always happens first. So first, he was influenced by a desire of a kingdom. Then miserat, he had sent out nuntios, messengers, ad gentes proximas, to the neighboring people. So he wants to get his kingdom going, and he sends out some messengers, okay? And what he's trying to do is really get them to join up, right? Make like sort of a marriage treaty. They can intermarry and join together and kind of get his city off and running. Then you have said, ei gentes timore adductae nuntios benigne non acceperant. So, but those people, right, ei gentes, those peoples rather, there, here we have adductae again, right? It's the same as, or not again, rather, it's a different form of adductus, right? The verb influence, but here it's got an ae on it because it's going with gentes, right? It's using that feminine plural ending, but it means the same thing, having been influenced. So the difference between adductus and adductae is really nothing in our English translation, but in Latin there's a difference because there's a gender difference and a number difference, right? Romulus is masculine singular, gentes is feminine plural. So that's why you're seeing different spellings, right? With those first and second declension adjective endings. So what are they influenced by, the other people? They're influenced timore, by fear, right? So they're not influenced by cupiditate, right? A desire of a kingdom like Romulus. No, they're influenced by fear. They're kind of afraid of these people, okay? They non acceperant. They did not welcome, or they had not welcomed, rather, pluperfect, the nuntios, the messengers, kindly, benigne, right? So they don't like Romulus's messengers because they don't like the Romans. Okay, notice how the PPP, the perfect passive participle, came before our main verb, acceperant. Then you have omnes finitimi nuntios a Romulo misos pepulerant. Okay, so all the neighbors, omnes finitimi, right? All the neighboring peoples, or all the neighbors, right? And again, notice how we have misos here, which is a fourth principal part, right? So it's a perfect passive participle, but it's describing nuntios, which is why you're seeing it as the accusative plural, right? Masculine accusative singular. So misos and nuntios are going together here. So what did all these people do, the neighboring people? Pepulerant, they had driven out, right? They had driven out the nuntios, the messengers, misos a Romulo, having been sent, misos, perfect passive participle, right? Having been sent by Romulus. So what happened first? Well, first they got sent by Romulus, the participle, right? The perfect passive participle, and then they got sort of rejected by all these people, right? They got kicked out. They're not allowing them in, they get driven out. Okay, so again, notice how the participle works. And here it's just using an accusative form because it's describing the direct object of the sentence. No big deal. Okay, then you have etaque nova concilia capta sunt, right? So nova concilia, right? New plans capta sunt, or sorry, capta sunt rather, they were made. Okay, now here is a really important thing to notice. Capta is also a fourth principal part. Okay, so misos, capta, adductae, adductus, they're all fourth principal parts. Here's the difference. Adductus, adductae, and misos are all by themselves. That makes them a perfect passive participle. Capta is going with sunt, which means it's just the perfect tense passive voice. Okay, so when you have a form of the verb to be going with that fourth principal part, it is not a participle. That's an important thing to think about. Okay, so new plans were made, right? They were made. It's just perfect passive. Okay. Then we continue on. You have is Romae ludos paravit et Sabinos ad eos vocavit. So he, meaning Romulus, in Rome, Romae here's locative. So he in Rome, paravit ludos, he prepared games. And he vocavit, he called the Sabinos, the Sabines, ad eos, to them. Okay, so in other words, Romulus is making a new plan, right? So he prepared games, and he called the Sabines to Rome to come hang out with the Romans, right? He's inviting them to this competition, these games. Okay. Then you have Sabini, nuntium a Romulo misum acceperant et eum libenter audiverant. Okay, so here we have the Sabines. That's our main, our subject rather, Sabini, right? So the Sabines, they accepted right? Or they welcomed, acceperant. So they don't kick out the messengers, they welcome the messenger, right? Acceperant nuntium, they welcome the messenger, misum a Romulo. So here we have the same sort of participle, perfect passive participle, but instead of misos to describe the messengers, plural, we have misum because it's describing nuntium, one messenger. So they welcomed the messenger having been sent by Romulus, right? A Romulo misum. And they audiverunt eum libenter. So they listened, or they heard him out, listened to him, eum libenter, gladly. So they gladly listened to him. So they hear him out, they welcome him in, and they listen to his message, right? So the Sabines actually bring the messenger in. Then you have tum Sabini Romam venturi uxores et liberos convacaverunt. There we go. Okay. So then the Sabines, okay. So what did they do? They convacaverunt. They called together their uxores et liberos, their women and children, or their wives and children. So they call them together, and then you have this. You have venturi. Okay, so venturi is a giveaway. The UR, it's a future participle. The I on the end of it is describing Sabini, right? That's why you have the long I. So you can say about to come to Rome, right? Or going to come to Rome, or about to come to Rome. So the Sabines about to come to Rome, meaning they haven't done it yet, right? It's a future participle, but they're going to do it. What did they do? They called together their wives and their children. So first they call the wives and children together, and then they're going to go to Rome, right? That's how the future participles work in here. Then you have feminae domicilia relicturae multa fecerunt. Okay, so feminae are the women. Okay, here we have relicturae. Again, the UR is giving it away, right? So you have a future participle. You can tell by the UR. So the women going to leave behind, or about to leave behind, their domicilia, right? Their homes, their dwellings. They multa fecerunt. They made many things. Or they did many things. Is probably a better way to do it. So they did all these things to prepare because they were going to leave behind their domicilia, right? Their homes. That's why you have the relicturae there. Okay, and notice how relicturae, again, future participles, just like perfect passive ones, they're using first and second declension adjective endings, and they're using the fourth principal part, right? So that's why you have venturi going with Sabini and relicturae going with feminae, right? They're just matching case number and gender. Then you have tandem, omnia ad iter parata erant. So finally, or at last, omnia, everything, parata erant. Here we have parata, that is a fourth principal part, but it's going with erant. So it's not a participle. This is the pluperfect passive. Okay, so everything had been prepared ad iter, for the journey. Okay, so everything was ready for the journey to Rome. Then it continues, and you have Sabini cum feminis et liberis Romam intraverunt. So the Sabines, they entered Rome, intraverunt Romam, right? They entered into Rome with their feminis, with their women, and their liberis, their children. Then you have Romulus, eos cernens et eorum clamores audiens gaudio motus est. So Romulus, right? The main verb here is motus est. He was moved, gaudio, with joy. So he's happy. But the question is why? And you can tell by the participles. So we have cernanes and audiens. Notice the ns ending on those. That's a very distinct ending for a present active participle, the nominative singular case. It's the only time you're going to see it. Otherwise, it would be an nt. So these two participles are describing Romulus. So the first thing Romulus is doing while he's happy, remember, he was moved with joy. The present participle means it's happening at the same time. He was eos cernanes, right? So he was seeing them, meaning the Sabines, and audiens, hearing. So he's seeing and hearing. He's seeing them, eos, and he's hearing their shouts, eorum clamores, right? He's hearing their shouts. He was moved by joy. So when Romulus sees and hears the Sabines showing up, he's super excited that they actually came. Then you have tandem erat magnus numerus feminarum in urbe. So finally, or at last, there was erat magnus numerus feminarum. There was a great number of women in urbe, in the city. Remember, they don't have any women, so now he's happy because all these women showed up, right? The daughters and the wives. Then you have Romulus, apud nobiles Romanos sedens et multa cogitans cum gaudio certamina spectavit. Okay, so Romulus, he's described as sedens, right? Sitting. It's a present active participle, nominative singular. It's describing Romulus. So sitting among the nobiles Romanos, the Roman nobles. Okay, so sitting among the Roman nobles. And not only that, he's also described as cogitans, thinking multa, about many things. So he's sitting there and he's thinking a bunch of stuff. Spectavit certamina, he watched the games, right? The competitions, cum gaudio, with joy. So Romulus is happy. He's sitting there. He's watching a lot of stuff. And he's thinking a lot of stuff because he has a plan going on here. Okay. Then you have Sabini quoque prope sedentes et ludos spectantes gaudio moti sunt. So here we have two more present participles, sedentes and spectantes. Notice how they have the nt ending followed by that third declension adjective ending. That's the present participle. So sedentes and spectantes are both nominative plural. Okay, so there's no ns because they're plural. They're describing Sabini. So the Sabines too are also sedentes prope, are sitting nearby, right? So you can say the Sabines also sitting nearby, and spectantes ludos, and watching the games. So the Sabines are described as sitting and watching, right? So they're also sitting there, sitting and watching, okay? And not only that, they moti sunt gaudio, they were moved with joy too, right? So not only Romulus, but the Sabines are hanging out, having a good time, and they're also, moved with joy or moved by joy, and they're sitting and watching the games too, right, with Romulus and the Romans. Then we continue. You have Romani spectabat os Romuli cernentes gaudium Sabinorum et audientes clamores spectatorum. So the Romans spectabat, they were watching the os Romuli, the sort of face of Romulus. So they're looking at their king and watching his face, right? So the Romans were watching the face of Romulus, and not only that, they cernentes, right? So you have this present participle, but notice how it's genitive singular. It's describing Romulus. So they're watching the face of Romulus, and it's not just Romulus, but it's Romulus watching, right? Cernentes, right? So they're watching the face of sort of watching Romulus, or the face of Romulus detecting or seeing the gaudium Sabinorum, the joy of the Sabines. So in other words, the Romans, to unpack this, are looking at Romulus. Romulus is cernentes gaudium Sabinorum. He's watching the joy of the Sabines, and hearing audientes, the clamores spectatorum, the shouts of the spectators. Okay, so Romulus's face is looking around and kind of seeing and hearing all this joy and good things. But the next line kind of tells you what's really going on. You have os Romuli apud nobiles Romanos sedentes et multa cogitantes nihil significaba. So the face of Romulus sitting among the nobles, right? Sedentes, again, is going with Romuli. Sedentes apud nobiles Romanos, so sitting among the Roman nobles, and cogitantes, thinking multa, many things. What was his face doing? Well, the main verb is significaba. It was signifying nihil, nothing. So in other words, it was expressing nothing, is kind of one way to think about it. So Romulus has this sort of cold expression on his face, and they're not entirely sure why. Well, it's because he has a plan here. Then you have quid est, cur Romulus surgit, right? So what is it, right? Quid est, what is it? Why is Romulus getting up? Right? Why does Romulus surgit? Why is he getting up? Daturne signum a Romulo stante. So is the signal, signum is your subject, is the signal being given, datur, is it given or is it being given by Romulus standing, by standing Romulus? Notice how stante, the present participle, is describing Romulo, so it's ablative. So he's standing up, right? But in the context of this sentence, he's the one giving the signal. We have a passive verb, so the signal is given by Romulus standing. So to make it a question, you say, is the signal being given by Romulus standing, right? So they're wondering why all of a sudden he stands up, and then you have your answer, signum datur, the signal is being given, right? So this is a signal from Romulus. Romani ludos intermittunt et filias Sabinorum rapiunt. So the Romans, they intermittunt, they sort of stop the games or interrupt the games, and they seize the daughters of the Sabines, right? The Filias Sabinorum. So this is sometimes called the rape or the abduction of the Sabine women. The Romans' plan all along was to lure them in, have them partying, not paying attention, and then steal all their daughters, right? This is how they're stealing women. Clamores patrum filias pententium undique audiuntur. So the shouts of fathers, and they're not just fathers, they're pententium fathers, they're searching fathers, right? Or looking fathers, right? So you might even say the shouts of the fathers looking for their filias, looking for their daughters, right? Undique audiuntur, they were heard or are heard, undique, on all sides or everywhere. So all you can hear is the shouts of fathers looking for their daughters because they all just got abducted, okay? Then you have eas frustra petunt. So they are seeking them, petunt eas, they're seeking them, meaning the daughters. Notice how eas is feminine, right? It's talking about the daughters. They're seeking them frustra in vain, right? Virgines in casas a Romanis rapiuntur. The maidens or the young girls, rapiuntur, the young girls are carried off, right? They're taken or carried off into the casas, the houses, or the huts, however you want to kind of do that, right? The huts by the Romans, meaning they take them and they run away into their houses. Okay, it's kind of a different description in other sources, but sure, we'll go with this. Okay, so they take them away. Then you have sic feminae ab audaci Romulo Romam ductae sunt. So thus, or in this way, women, ductae sunt, they are led. Notice how ductae is a fourth principal part, but it's not a participle because it's going with sunt, right? It's just perfect passive. So they are led, or they were led to Rome, Romam, by audaci Romula, by bold Romulus, or sort of daring or bold Romulus. Okay, so that story has a decent amount of participles in a couple of different ways. So you got to see present, perfect, and future participles in context. That's why this story is, or these stories are always good. It lets you kind of see them and understand how they work. So hopefully it made some sense. I know it's a little bit trickier, so you have to go back and work on it a little bit. Feel free to do it, but hopefully it made some sense and you didn't have too much struggle working your way through. If you have any questions at all, feel free to put them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help you, but the best way to do it is practice, right? Practice reading this, do the practice problems on the textbook, and at some point, your ultimate goal is to be able to read through the story, understand everything, and not need any help. If you're in that place, that's a really good sign that you're ready to move on to the next story. Good luck.